On today's World Insight, as COP29, the UN climate conference, wraps up in Azerbaijan's capital, Baku, a new start with funding for climate action. That's as China doubles down on green innovation toward the world's carbon neutral goals. So, what's next?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. After 2 weeks of negotiations, the COP29 climate conference concluded in Azerbaijan, with discussions centered on funding, adaptation, and emissions reductions. As debates over climate financing and net zero goals persist, the question remains, will COP29 drive tangible progress? Meanwhile, as one of the world's fastest reducers of energy intensity, how might Chinese innovation inspire global solutions? For deeper insights, let's hear from our panelists. Joining us on COP29 in London, Bob Ward, Policy and Communications Director at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment from the London School of Economics and Political Science. In Brussels, Wendell Trill, Climate Change Science and Policy Analyst. In Beijing, Ma Jun, Director of the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs and founder of the Blue Map app. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. I understand all of you were in Baku for COP29. Now, may I invite 1 or 2 sentences to briefly have your views on what is the nature of this COP29, what has been achieved, what are the pities that you think can be worked on in the near future? Let's start from Mr. Ward.
Hi. Well, it was very important that this meeting reached an agreement on climate finance for developing countries, and that agreement was secured. The sums were not as high as they should have been, but it's very important that that support is there, because over the next 12 months, every country has to come forward with pledges for increased ambition ahead of the next UN summit in Brazil.
Mr. Trail?
I think what is very important is, of course, that there was an agreement, although not an ideal agreement. And I think the challenge will be to improve the level of trust between the participants in the COP, definitely if we want to get to better results at COP30. So that will be an important issue to work on in the coming 12 months.
I see. Mr. Ma?
I think it's very important to reach this agreement, despite it's a compromise. I think it sets a set path for future discussions in this climate emergency situation.
Now, you all talk about something has been reached. Now, compared to what were the ambitious goals years earlier, particularly before 2020, how would you describe the degrees of these goals, Mr. Ma?
Yeah, these goals are, some people will call it ambitious, but many others criticize that it's far from being sufficient to meet the need of the developing countries. I think, the countries can still come together to reach this goal, because we still have some clear leaders, and on the other hand, the major country, the president-elect from America now threatens to pull out of Paris Agreement again. I think it has cast a real shadow on this whole global climate governance. I think that has also motivated the parties to come together to make sure that the whole climate negotiation and financing won't be undermined.
Now, how much trust is there still
This process, the UN process, involves nearly 200 countries, and they have to reach consensus on these issues, which is very, very challenging. And you cannot do that unless countries trust each other. And I have to say that the rich countries have largely betrayed the trust of the developing countries by not honoring previous commitments and by the way in which they've conducted these negotiations over the past couple of years around climate finance. But trust is essential, and we are all bound by this. Every single country needs to have a successful plan to tackle climate change, because the impacts of climate change continue to increase until the whole world gets to effectively zero emissions of greenhouse gases. That means everybody has to do their part. And that's why I think everybody is bound together. And I would hope that trust is rebuilt over the next 12 months ahead of Brazil, particularly by the developed countries coming forward with much stronger pledges for action than they currently have.
Mr. Ma, China has always been facing this question: whether are you a developing country or a developed economy, and therefore how much should China contribute? Now, I understand China officially made very clear its stance. Tell us more about what you have learned.
China, on the one hand, really want to emphasize that it's about its willingness to support the developing countries to address climate change. So Chinese delegation disclosed that since 2016, China has contributed already 177 billion yuan to developing countries already, and in the meantime, China want to emphasize this common but differentiated responsibility principles because it doesn't want to blur this line because it still believe that the developed, the industrialized countries still need to show the responsibility for its historic emission. And I think many other developing countries also hold the same view. And having said that, China's making really great efforts, especially during the crucial last several days, to work together with other countries, including the developing countries, but also including the global climate leaders like the European Union, to try to facilitate the reaching of this agreement. By making some, I think eventually, to see that globally compromise can be reached. So in this text, there's a mentioning that developed countries must take the lead, but in the meantime, it also includes the sentences like encouraging developing country parties to make contributions.
Another important component that is hanging in the air, the elephant in the room, is what's likely to be the actions and the decisions made by the United States, historically one of the largest emitters and now the second largest emitters of the world, do once the new administration comes into power, knowing that the first term of that administration withdrew from the Paris Agreement. So on that, how much does it bother everyone when they try to discuss what is likely to be the immediate goals, what are the blueprints to implement the goals, and what should be the outlines for the future, especially for the next 5 years, since all of you are talking about 2025 already. So tell us more about how do you see that elephant in the room? Do you see the rest of the world, excluding the United States, are ready to deal with whatever might be the near future reality, Mr. Ward?
Well, you're quite right that Mr. Trump's election cast a bit of a shadow over the talks. And I think we have to look very carefully at what's happening in the United States. If the United States turns away from international markets for low carbon goods, then it will suffer enormously financially. And so there will be private companies, including Tesla, of course, headed by Elon Musk, who's an advisor to Donald Trump. He will not want the domestic market for electric vehicles in the United States to be damaged because it would damage his business. He will also not want a trade war with China because he has business in China as well. Biden administration unlocked huge amounts of investment across the United States in accelerating low carbon technologies. A lot of that investment is benefiting Republican states. And I think Mr. Trump will be very careful about trying to wind that back. So we will have to see. It's certainly not helpful to have Mr. Trump withdraw the United States and to be denying the reality of climate change. But I think the world will just get on with it. And actually, there might be opportunities for China and other countries in international markets if the US does become more inward looking.
Mr. Trail.
I think it's very unfortunate, of course, not only because it's a president, but it's also an indication of the fact that a large part of the American public is very much inward-looking. And when we speak about the provision of climate finance, obviously that will be very limited from the US in the coming years. If we speak about emission reductions, obviously there's a number of economic developments that will continue, but it will have a negative impact, and we will need to see how much other countries will be impacted by that, or will actually continue to move forward. And to a large extent, I think if you look at Europe, if you look at China and other of the big emitters, I think they will continue on the path that they're already on, irrespective of what is happening in the US, unless, of course, there would be huge international economic challenges coming from the US administration. But I think that is still to be seen how much that will effectively happen or not.
Mr. Ma, from where you are, how would you articulate that, and what have you been hearing?
Those NGO and other colleagues from America, they actually concern the most because there will be highly limited space for them to continue their efforts within their country, and the global climate governance will also, be affected. I think the NDC negotiators will be under pressure when historically the largest emitter pulling out of this Paris Agreement again. If we're talking about the world has changed, this is very different from 8 years ago. At that time, when the first Trump administration withdrew from the Paris Agreement, there is a real sense of frustration and concern that the global governance will be truly undermined. But this time, I think there's a kind of a different sentiment because many increasing number of all the people in the world have recognized that take the decarbonization may generate new green economic growth. Just taking China as an example, the renewable energy and related industries have grown exponentially in recent years and have account for 40% of China's GDP growth last year. So this is extremely important. So Paris Agreement will have its own resilience, and part of that, a major part of that, is the potential for the future green development.
Talking about green development, we are really moving on to another important component of discussion, I guess. Mr. Ward, knowing the green transformation that we are seeing today can well accomplished to a larger degree by the latest technologies and applications of these technologies. But the other side of the story is trade disputes and geopolitics seem to hinder the wider spread and also the more accessibility of these technologies to a larger proportion of the populations worldwide. What do you make of these apparent dilemma?
Well, in general, the whole world benefits from a free trade system because we all rely on the trade of goods for our economy and for being able to access goods and services that we need in our daily lives. So that the world benefits. There is, though, concern about places which are not putting strong measures in place to curb carbon dioxide emissions from their industries. And it means that other countries where they are putting those kinds of constraints in are worried that they're going to be undercut. That's why there is this discussion about so-called carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which would put tariffs on essentially dirty goods. But it is an important principle that we should be trying to encourage investment. And I, for instance, do not agree with the tariffs that the European Union are planning to put in place on Chinese manufactured electric vehicles, because China invested, its industries invested in the technologies of the future. It now produces high quality, low cost electric vehicles. The whole world can benefit from that. And I'm afraid Europe is trying to protect its industries, which did not invest enough in that development. And I just don't think that's the right way forward. So we will need, I think, increasingly bodies like the WTO to be involved. I know the head of the WTO was at COP talking about trade, and I would expect future COPs to be talking about trade relationships as well as all these other issues.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously there's quite a number of challenges around. One is that I wouldn't kind of completely agree with the concept that free trade is the solution to everything. I think there's a number of limitations to what the earth that we're living on can sustain, and I think that there's a need for a number of trade restrictions to ensure that the resource extraction remains within certain limits, which is one of the kind of backbones of the EU deforestation regulation, which aims to limit trade in certain commodities. Secondly, I think the challenge is that climate change is a global problem, which means that what happens in one country impacts actually all the other countries of the world, which means that the solution is also a collective one. And so the challenge will be that there are a number of free riders that don't want to invest in climate policies. And so trade measures can be one of the ways to ensure that everybody kind of comes on the same level playing field. And in that sense, I do think that there is reason to look at what can be done to ensure that all countries at least contribute to the solution of the problem. And trade measures can be part of those tools. But of course, they need to be done carefully and with the right level of incentives, etc., etc.
I understand the principles that you have just described, but there are a lot of adjectives in it, and therefore, how to understand these adjectives, and as a result of that discussion, how to deal with the urgency of climate change as we speak, while there are availability of both the technologies and the products, which are not necessarily as expensive as just say 5 years ago. Mr. Trail, can you further explain to us what you meant?
Yes, I mean, I think there's two sides of the coin. One is that we need to look at how can we promote the alternative technologies, and mainly thinking about renewable energy, wind and solar power, etc. And at the same time, how can we actually give incentives to phase out pollution? And one of those incentives, and it's not the only one, but it's one of those, is putting a price on pollution. And kind of having that on a more global scale, I think, is one of the reasons behind the current EU trade proposals around this CBAM. So I think it's important to have both coins and both sides of the coin, and trade measures can help in kind of enforcing a certain price on pollution worldwide.
Yeah, in the West, I think there's some misunderstanding that China's trying to just subsidize its industry for cheap exports. But in reality, China by itself has been, trying to deploy the renewable energy in a unprecedented way. By June this year, Chinese China's renewable energy target set for 2030, 1,200 gigawatts of installation have been achieved, by June this year, so 6 years earlier. And in the meantime, on the electric vehicle side, China's since July this year, the low domestic market penetration of the e-vehicles have topped 50%. Every 2 cars sold, one of them is an electric vehicle. So it is the domestic market which actually have been created for all these renewable related products. And during the process, as mentioned by Mr. Wall, there's a vast, enormous investment being put for the development and also for the R&D. As a result, the scale of the economy and all the R&D, make it more cost, effective.
By the way, many of the European car makers, they have already designed their strategy. For example, forming joint ventures with China, having Chinese EV companies to work together back at home, and at the same time to jointly develop new technologies with Chinese counterparts from China. So it's not that the European car makers as a whole reject what's going on, but rather some of the sporadic car manufacturing industries in certain European countries, plus some of the European politicians, seem to have very different views. And I could give an enormous amount of examples to suggest why I said so. So, Mr. Trail, can you be more specific when you say European car makers?
Yeah, but there definitely is a fear of competition, but I actually wanted to say that for European politicians, they are looking at what happened with the solar industry or what is happening with the battery manufacturing industry in Europe, and they're kind of not necessarily taking very rational decisions, but rather kind of have an overall fear of kind of Europe being in a weak competitive status vis-a-vis, in this case, China. And that's why a number of rather irrational decisions have been made, I think, because yes, Europe wants to promote electrical cars. They even have a legislation that from 2035 onwards, no internal combustion engine cars can be sold. So there's every reason to say, okay, let's embrace the cheap electric vehicles, because it's one of the ways to ensure the penetration of electric vehicles on the market. At the same time, there's a level of fear of the Chinese car industry taking over the European industry, and I think that's where the problem is. And of course, there's a number of countries, in particular Germany, that is very concerned about that because of the large presence of the car industry in Germany.
Having said that, though, given whatever the realities that the three of you are describing, certainly different versions that I see, do you think there is enough space for economies besides the United States, which we have to, as all of you say, wait and see what the new administration is going to do? But then, what about for the rest of the world? Is there still enough and strong consensus and bond for them to be together for the climate change efforts, as we are already in the post-Baku time, leading up to the next important COP, which is going to design the 5-year plan for the next, to design the 5-year plan for the next very important juncture of climate change? Mr. Ward.
Well, the fact is that we can see the impacts of climate change all around us at the moment, affecting all parts of the world and getting worse. And they will continue to get worse until the world gets to net zero emissions. So that cannot be ignored. It's going to be far more expensive and far more difficult to try and cope with those impacts than stopping them from getting worse and worse. And remember, at the moment, we're on a pathway that would mean potential warming of the Earth by 3 degrees by the end of this century compared to pre-industrial, something the Earth has not seen for 3 million years, at a period when the global sea levels were 5 to 25 meters higher than today. That's not the kind of world in which anybody will prosper. And so we do need a far stronger system and far more action by all countries, because we're all collectively in this same situation.
All right. Mr. Trail?
Yes, well, climate change is a complex issue and it encompasses everything in economy and society. So there's many different issues. On top of that, with 200 countries negotiating all with their own kind of concerns and needs, it's definitely hugely challenging. But the fact that we did get an agreement in Baku, the fact that we got kind of strong statements on climate from the G20 Leaders Summit does mean that there's still a sufficient amount of countries that actually want to look at how can we do that together. But the sense of urgency really needs to increase. I think that it's clear impacts of climate change are already visible in all parts of the world, affecting the society as a whole. And so that needs to be tackled, and with more urgency than we're currently doing it.
Last but not least, Mr. Ma.
Yes, the increasing frequency of all the extreme weather events and the potential catastrophic climate change impacts have brought most of the countries together. You know, despite some of the disappointed expressed, some of the frustration expressed, but most of the countries still want to come together to find their way to address the climate change, and I hope that you know, raising ambition is important, but implementation is equally important as well.
Ma Jun, Wendell Trail, Bob Ward, thank you so much for being with us. All the best. And that's all we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us.